Hello. Hello, Assalamu alaikum,
السلام
and welcome to
عليكم
this
ومرحبا
glorious
بكم
location of
لهذا
the Museum
المكان
of Islamic
الرائع
Art here
متحف
in
الفن
Doha. This
الإسلامي هنا
magnificent city
في
that is
الدوحة.
attracting millions of
هذه
people from all
المدينة
over
التي
the world. I'm so honored
باتت
to be here.
تجتذب
My name is Roman
الملايين.
Ali. I'm a
اسمي
UK-based
رومان
journalist,
علي، أنا
and I'm also the
صحفية
Director of
من المملكة
Communications for Exploring
المتحدة، وأنا
Islam
مديرة
Foundation.
الاتصالات في
I'd also
مؤسسة
like to add we do
Exploring
have today's event
إسلام،
translated
التعرف على
into Arabic
الإسلام. اليوم
by
لدينا
our esteemed
ترجمة
translator
فورية
Muwafiq
من
Tawfiq. Thank you
مترجمنا
so much
المعروف
for being
السيد
here
موفق
today.
توفيق.
And we'd
شكرا
also
لك
like to
وشكر
welcome
لكم.
the 32 students
أيضا
hailing
أود
from
أن
all over the
أرحب
world who have been invited to come here on
ب32
account
من
of
الطلبة
academic
من كل
excellence.
أنحاء
We have
العالم
with us students
الذين
from
دعوا
Somalia,
إلى الدوحة من
Sudan,
الصومال
Rohingya,
والسودان
Syria,
وروهينجيا
Palestine,
وسوريا وفلسطين
the Uyghur region, and
وأيضا
Yemen,
منطقة
Iraq, and
الريغا
Lebanon.
واليمن
Salam and
والعراق
welcome to
ولبنان.
you as well,
السلام
wherever
عليكم
you are with
ومرحبا
us.
بكم.
Today's
يسعدنا
event
أن
forms an
تكونوا
important
معنا
part of a
اليوم. هذا
campaign that's
الحدث
powered by
حدث
Exploring
مهم
Islam Foundation
حقيقة
and the
ضمن
Islam and
حملة
Muslims Initiative. You may have seen
Exploring Islam
billboards
ومبادرة
and
الإسلام
info
والمسلمين.
booths dotted
ربما
around the city, and all of
رأيتم
this
الكثير
is
من
part of
الإعلانات
the very
والمطويات
exciting and dynamic
والمنشورات،
campaign
كلها
that ties in
جزء
with
من
that grant of
هذه
funding and
الحملة
is an
الرائعة
official resource to raise
التي
awareness
تتماشى
about
جنبا
Muslims and
إلى
Islam
جنب
for visitors
مع
and for
نهائيات كأس
audience
العالم
alike.
للتعريف
Now,
بالإسلام
today here we
للزوار
have a
ومشجعي
very,
كرة
very important
القدم.
event.
اليوم لدينا حدث
We are
مهم
so privileged
للغاية
and
ونحن
honoured, and I'm
سعداء
slightly dazed as
ويشرفنا.
well, to
أنا
be
أيضا
inviting
مذهولة
Dalia Mogahed on stage very
أن
shortly, someone
أدعو
who I've
داليا
respected and
مجاهد،
followed
وهي
for, I don't know how
شخصية
many years.
أحترمها
Dalia
وأتابعها منذ
Mogahed is
سنوات.
the
داليا
Director of
مجاهد
Research
هي
at the Institute
مديرة
of Social
الأبحاث
Policy and
في
Understanding,
مؤسسة
where she leads their pioneering
الدراسات
research and
الاجتماعية
co-creation programs on
والتفاهم
American Muslims.
في
She's the
الولايات
former executive
المتحدة،
director of the
وهي
Gallup Center
المدير
for Social
التنفيذي
Studies, and she
السابق في
co-authored
مؤسسة
with Janet
غالوب
Esposito Who
لدراسات
Speaks for Islam, What a Billion
الإسلام،
Muslims
وقد
Really Need.
شاركت في تأليف
President Barack
كتابي
Obama appointed
مع
Dalia
جون
to the President's
إسبوسيتو
Advisory Council on
حول
Faith-Based and
من يمثل
Neighborhood
الإسلام،
Partnerships in
وأيضا
2009.
شاركت
You know,
في
Dalia has had
الكثير من
over 8.5 million views
الحملات.
on her TED Talk
وفي
in 2016. She's an
2016
expert commentator
قدمت
for global
تيد
media outlets.
توك
She's also the
محاضرة
CEO of Mogahed
لاقت
Consulting,
ترحيبا
and
ومتابعة
perhaps
من
my
600
favorite one of all,
مليون شخص.
she completely bossed it on the Daily
وطبعا
Show with Trevor Noah.
أيضا هي
Dalia,
مع
you are an inspiration. Please
تريفر
welcome Dalia
نوى
to the stage.
أدت أداء رائعا. أرحب بك داليا إلى المسرح، فتفضلي.
It's such an honor to have you with us.
يشرفنا أن
How are you doing?
تكوني
How was
معنا.
your
كيف
heart?
أنت؟ كيف؟ مرحبا. أولا أود أن أشكر الجميع الذين حضروا معنا في عصر هذا اليوم الجميل في هذا المسرح الجميل للحديث عن الأمل ومشافاة النفوس. طبعا أنا أود أن أعرف بنفسي بشكل شخصي أولا قبل الجانب المهني. أنا ولدت في القاهرة في مصر، وترعرعت في ماديسون في ويسكونسن في الغرب الأوسط الأمريكي، وهو الآن نحن نزلت الثلوج وغطت الأرض بنحو قدمين من الثلوج. السياسة في منطقتنا كانت تقدمية جدا، وفكرة العدالة الاجتماعية كانت منتشرة. وأنا عندما كنت في المدرسة كان عدد أفراد
where justice for people that had been oppressed for so long lies. Where do people really find liberation? And where I found that as a young person was actually in Islam and in the Quran, and I wasn't expecting it to be there. So I grew up not just inheriting Islam, but truly coming to it deliberately. And it didn't just answer my political questions, but as I grew up and as I went through so many challenges in my life, it really answered the questions of what was my purpose And what does it take to make sense of this very chaotic world? And so, though this might not be a topic you know me for, this is a topic I'm incredibly passionate about and asked if I could speak on it, because I think that that's what we're all hungering for. I think we are all desperate for a conversation on hope.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that and for choosing to talk about this topic, which of course is called The Heart on Hope, a conversation about healing. And I think every single person in this room has probably experienced some form of pain or hurt or grief or disappointment. And of course, I can probably speak for most of the people in this room where we felt real hurt when Morocco lost against France. That was pretty hard to watch. But, we witnessed, a team, the first Arab team, the first majority Muslim team, the first African team getting through to the quarterfinals. And they made sujood. They prostrated after every win. And still, after they lost to France, they still prostrated. And I loved your post about this on Instagram where you said, we should praise God and thank God in delight and in disappointment. So I just wanted to address this whole idea of denial and gratitude, being denied things when our prayers aren't answered. How does not having things, shape our faith?
I admired the Moroccan team when they were winning, but I honestly admired them even more after they lost to France by the way that they glowed. They showed the world what it looks like to live your values in delight and in disappointment, in triumph and in trials. The sujood at the end of the game when they lost, and they were almost there, and they tried so hard and they worked so hard, and still to thank God. And people were so confused. I think you may have seen some reporting that actually thought they were prostrating to their fans. That actually was the initial take by ESPN. It's if you're not familiar, ESPN is one of the largest media outlets in the world that covers sports. It's an American-based media outlet. It's owned by Disney. Disney is the largest media on earth. And so this high-level media outlet described what happened as them prostrating to their fans to thank them. The concept of thanking God after a loss was just like too crazy, too foreign, too unlikely that the reporter's mind went to this very strange place of actually thinking they're on the floor on their face thanking their fans. And alhamdulillah, it was corrected and he apologized, so I want to recognize that. But that was a teaching moment for the world, a concept in our faith that is so beautiful and profound, which is this idea of thanking, not just being patient, but actually grateful. Thanking God in triumph and in trials. What they were doing in that moment is saying that even in their loss, they won. Because they were thanking God for the strength to have gotten this far, which no one expected at the beginning of the World Cup. They were thanking God for the fact that they had the energy to stand up and be apologetically who they are, despite everything pulling them away from that. The thing about the Moroccan team that a lot of people may not realize is virtually none of them were born in Morocco, and virtually none of them were raised in Morocco. They're almost all European or North American, born and raised, very highly paid young men at the top of their athletic career. So in a space, in a culture, in a world where they have infinite access, infinite fame, lots of money and they're young, athletic men. And it's in that context that when the whole world is screaming their praise, they chose to get on their faces and their hands and their knees to whisper God's praise. And not just when they win, but amazingly and even more admirably when they lost. It was such a moment of just, I'll say it as dramatic, it was a moment of true beauty when they prostrated at the end of their loss to France. And I think that that moment was written for us to have this conversation and to teach something about who we are to the entire world.
So well said. And it was a real lesson for me as well, to remember to thank God in times of denial when your du'as, your prayers are not answered. And so many of us have faced that, when we're praying so much for a job, for a spouse, for good health, and yet we're still, but there is a struggle in that gratitude as well, isn't there?
There absolutely is. There absolutely is a struggle. And we can't deny that struggle. We can't pretend that it's easy. I think that what we learn, what is at the core of our faith, and I'll speak for myself, in these moments when I'm praying my eyes out and I'm crying to God and things are being delayed, I'm confused. I'm wondering why. And there's a couple things that I remind myself that I think help me with that struggle. And I hope they're helpful to some of you. The first thing that we have to start with in this conversation is, A, who is in charge of my life and what is his nature? What should I expect from him? If I truly believe that God is in charge of my life, that he decides, that his will is what comes to pass, then I need to ask, what is his nature? What are his attributes? And if I begin with the belief and the understanding and the conviction that I worship a loving, compassionate Lord, then everything has to be interpreted within that prism, within that filter. It's like if you have a good friend that you trust completely and you know that they love you and want the best for you. Let's even say a parent, a mother, and they are late picking you up one day. You're going to assume they have a good reason because of who they are to you. And it has to be even that much more with God. So the delays and the denials have to be seen within this paradigm of who is Allah. And if he is denying and delaying something I so desperately want, how do I see this within that? I one time wrote, let's start. What if we started with the assumption that everything is an act of love and mercy? What if that were just the assumption, the base assumption? How would we make meaning out of our life? And it's not, and Allah says he is, God says he is as we expect him to be. So it is not so far-fetched as to say that everything that happens to me, I can interpret as that being the default. And if it is, then even the trials are purifications, oftentimes protections, and then preparations for what I am meant to do next, for my purpose.
That's really powerful. And I know we spoke earlier about how gratitude or lack of gratitude feeds into our psychology. and that there are two different approaches to that. I would love for you to just highlight that right now.
You know, one of the most powerful ideas in a field called positive psychology, which is basically the study of well-being, is something referred to as abundance versus scarcity mindsets. And I'll just introduce this and then explain how it relates to concepts within our faith. So, an abundance mindset simply means that you see the world as a place where there's enough for everyone, where you will be okay, where you don't have to fight someone else to get what you need. There's abundance. There's enough. You are enough, and the world has enough for you. There's another mindset, and it's called scarcity. A scarcity mindset is there isn't enough. And you have to fight and rush and get and compete to just get what you need. And you're always worried about not having enough. And the interesting thing about scarcity mindsets and abundance mindsets is they have nothing, almost virtually nothing to do with how much you actually have. So people with literally millions of dollars in the bank can operate from a very scarcity mindset. And people with nothing but, you know, perhaps the next meal can operate from a very abundant mindset. And so what do these different mindsets lead to? And this is, I'm talking about psychology now. Scarcity mindsets end up causing people or are related to people being very Machiavellian. You know, the end justifies the means. I'm desperate. I have to do this or I won't get enough. It's not a generous way to be. You're always looking out for yourself. So they end up leading people into breaking their own value system, going against their own ethical framework, and being very stingy with giving anything away, even knowledge. So you might have people at work that operate from a scarcity mindset. They don't share their knowledge. They don't tell you something, you know, proactively that might help you with your job. Abundance mindsets, however, people are very generous. People are more likely to abide by their own ethical framework. They don't feel the need to compromise their ethics because there's enough for everyone. And then you look at the Quran, and we're told in Surah Al-Baqarah, and I'm just going to paraphrase the translation, that Shaitan, or Satan, promises you poverty and tells you or commands you to commit sin. Look at that. Poverty, scarcity, sin, which is the violation of your ethics. Exactly what a scarcity mindset is. But then the contrast is Allah promises you forgiveness and abundance. Now, why does forgiveness come before abundance? This is the beautiful thing. Because if you have been operating from a scarcity mindset, then you have been probably compromising your values. And you're operating from a place of shame. So the first thing you need to heal before you can even accept abundance is forgiveness. And then you're open to Allah's abundance. And when you experience that abundance, when you know where rizq comes from, and that's where abundance comes from, right? The abundance mindset comes from the belief that my provision is not from me. It's from an infinite source. And once I believe that, I'm always going to believe there's going to be enough. And then what happens? I'm generous. I know it's not from me. I can give it away. I'm more likely to abide by my ethical framework. I don't need to cut corners. I don't need to compromise my values. So this concept of scarcity and abundance is so powerful and so beautifully spelled out in our faith and in our scripture. And it's really a source of hope when it's internalized.
Yeah, and I think it's so important what you said about accepting that compassion as well from Allah. Sometimes we beat ourselves up a lot, especially as women. We beat ourselves up a lot. We're not compassionate towards ourselves. If we make a mistake, we scrutinize it. We don't forgive ourselves. So, how important is it for us to be a bit more merciful on ourselves as well and accept that compassion from the greater God?
I love the idea, and I think it's so conducive, it's so congruent with our faith of self-compassion. Now, self-compassion is misunderstood. It doesn't mean letting yourself off the hook or not holding yourself accountable. It's actually the opposite of that. So we have this concept in our society of shame. So what is shame? Let me define shame. And this is according to shame researcher Brene Brown, who literally studies shame as her discipline. And she defines shame as essentializing a mistake to who you are. So it's not, I feel bad because I did something wrong. It's, I am wrong. I am bad. I didn't just do something bad. That's guilt, and that's healthy. It's, I am essentially bad. And it's very hard for me to change because this is who I am. And shame is what Shaitan actually pushes. He doesn't push guilt. He doesn't want you to feel guilty. He wants you to feel shame. This is just who you are, so why even try? Why even, repent or try to be different? This is just who you are. You're bad. So once you fall into shame, Shaitan has you. Now, some people have mistakenly argued that the opposite of shame is pride. Shame and pride as opposites, and they're actually not opposites. Pride is the other side of the coin of shame because they're both rooted in the ego, in the nafs. Shame says, you are bad, and pride says, yes, you are, but be proud of it. Tell everybody. Don't be secretive about it. Scream it from the highest towers. So pride doesn't actually argue with the essential question of, this is just how I am, and I can't change. What is the opposite of shame? The actual opposite of shame is self-compassion. Here is what self-compassion says. Self-compassion, according to researchers in this field, has 3 elements. The first is self-kindness. What does that mean? It means your inner voice that everyone has speaks to you like you would speak to a good friend. Like you would give nasiha, you give advice to someone who you love in a gentle way. I mean, we have ethics around and etiquette around how to give advice. Do we use it for ourselves? Are we kind when we correct ourselves in our own minds, or are we insulting ourselves? Are we doing things that we're actually not allowed to do with other people when we're correcting them? The harshness by which we correct ourselves is actually not, it's not correct. It's not the way of our tradition. So self-kindness in correcting ourselves. The second part of self-compassion is something called common humanity. And it basically says, this is something other people struggle with too. I'm not the only one. Why is this important? Because one of Shaitan's tools or tricks is he tells you that you're the only one and you're isolated and not to talk to anybody about it, not to tell your family, not to reach out to your mentors. You're bad, you're disgusting, and you're the only one dealing with this. So he isolates you because he's a cult leader. Really, Shaitan operates like a cult leader in a very interesting way. And cult leaders always isolate you from those who love you. The third part of self-compassion is something they call mindfulness. And what that means is you don't over-identify with this thing you're struggling with. You don't say, this is who I am. You say, I'm struggling with this thing. So it's the opposite of shame because it doesn't make it your identity. So if we approach responding to shame, and even with each other, even in communities, even in parenting, shame's response cannot be pride. It has to be self-compassion. And it's an incredibly powerful tool. It's an incredibly powerful concept that is congruent with what we believe, that can really protect you against this tool of Satan that he uses against us. Shame is the tool of Shaitan.
And that also feeds into notions around anxiety and depression. You know, I was speaking to a friend a few years ago, and she was clearly going through a lot of trauma. And I said, yeah, maybe you should seek counseling or therapy. She goes, no, I have Allah, I'm not depressed. I'm not depressed, as if going through depression negated her faith in some way. But, how important is it for us to acknowledge that we are going through difficulty? How important is it to keep our faith going, but at the same time acknowledge that, I am feeling anxious?
I mean, this is such an important area, and one that I would, I definitely don't want to overstep my bounds as a non-mental health professional. But what I will say as a general public service announcement is that having sadness or anxiety is part of the human experience. It does not mean you have low faith. And we know that because the Prophet himself, alayhi salatu wassalam, experienced something is literally called the year of sorrow. If being sad means you have low faith, we wouldn't have a year of sorrow. So feeling sadness is a part of the human experience. And in fact, emotions have a purpose. This is the amazing thing. Allah created everything, and he created everything for a purpose, including our emotions and including things like sadness. I recently read a book called Bittersweet, and I loved it. I really recommend it. It's by a woman named Susan Cain, who after I read the book, I actually contacted her, and now we're like good friends. Susan wrote this beautiful book called Bittersweet about how longing and sorrow makes us whole. And believe it or not, this isn't about clinical depression, of course. This is something that requires therapy and sometimes even medicine. But just this melancholy sadness that can sometimes be bittersweet has a purpose. And sadness can actually give us a clarity that we didn't have before. Sadness brings benefit. This is like, I'm talking about from a scientific perspective, psychological perspective. Even sadness has a purpose. So to say that we're going to deny the existence of sadness in the presence of faith is to ignore the seerah, and it's to ignore science as well.
And I wanted to bring in the notion of patience or sabr. When any one of us is going through some kind of difficulty, often the auto response is, oh, be patient. If you've lost a loved one, be patient. A relative of mine lost her child, and the response was just be patient. But in that moment, she was distraught, and she didn't want to hear that over and over again. So, what does sabr actually mean, and what should it mean to us, and what does it mean to you?
I think sabr is one of the most misunderstood, concepts of our faith. So one beautiful explanation of sabr that I learned from my teachers, that was explained by Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, is he said that he defines sabr as acting in the right way for the situation. In any situation, responding in the correct way was what sabr meant. So what does this mean? If I'm in a situation where I see oppression, I see injustice, either done to me or done to someone else, and I have the ability to do something to correct it, the sabr response is to work against oppression. Sabr is sometimes thought of as a passive response, and that is not the case. When the Prophet ﷺ left for his hijrah from Mecca to Medina, he could have just stayed in Mecca and had, quote, the conventional definition of sabr, because he was being abused. His followers were being abused. Why was he looking for other places that were more hospitable? Because he had sabr. Sabr in that situation was to find a way out. There are situations, if I get, la qadar Allah, a diagnosis for a terminal illness that has no cure, and I have nothing I can do, the sabr response is to accept it and to surrender to God's will. That's the sabr response in that case. But in the Quran, I think it's so interesting that the word sabr or sabrun is often used and is used in contexts that we in our everyday life would probably be surprised by. So one perfect example is the story of the march to meet Goliath and his army. And this story, which is explained in Surah Al-Baqarah, describes this profound scene of a group of ragtag, ill-trained, not many good weapons brigade marching to meet a giant and his army. And before they meet him, before they meet Goliath, they had to first deal with an internal struggle. And so they were told by their leader that as thirsty as they were, as tired as they were, that they were going to pass by a river. And they were instructed that no one should drink from the river except a tiny handful, if they must. And that if they do that, then they will remain from among the group. And if they violate this rule, they will be excluded. And it says that most of them failed this test. And so then after they crossed the river, the ones who had actually passed this test looked around. They were already a small group. They already had poor weaponry. They already weren't well trained. And now, after this test, they were even smaller in number because so many had failed it. And so some of them, within this group of believers now, said, we are defeated. We have no chance. They were looking at the facts on the ground. They were looking at the means. It's understandable why they would have thought they had no chance. But then there was another group that had a different perspective, whose intellectual horizons weren't focused on the means, but on the creator of means. Because in the Quran, they are described as those who knew they were going to meet their Lord. And that group had a different perspective. They said, how often does a small group overtake a large group with the permission of God. And then they said something else very important. And God is with as-sabirin. Wow. So in this context, those with sabr were the ones who wanted to keep marching and meet a giant and his army. They weren't the ones that wanted to stay back and give up. So sabr is not passive. Sabr means steadfastness, perseverance, having your mental horizon on God, not on the means. And it's such a beautiful example of courage as well. Where does courage come from? Courage and sabr are often related. In many cases, sabr is courage, acted out. Their courage to go meet the giant and his army came from the fact that they remembered who they were going to be meeting later on, the creator of that giant. And in that knowledge, and in that focal point that they were thinking about, when Allah becomes our focal point, giants are dwarfed, and battles with them feel doable. And that's the power of sabr correctly understood.
Thank you. That's an incredible explanation. Thank you so much. I think that also ties into your TED talk, really, which was about being a Muslim in America and all the tests and the challenges that comes with. Things like challenges of racism, anti-Muslim sentiment. We have societal challenges that we face as Muslims, as minorities in the countries like the US and the UK. We have challenges within our own communities and within our own selves. And you addressed a lot of this in your TED talk. So how do we kind of cope with all these struggles? How do we protect our hearts from despair when we're just like battling hardship after hardship? There might be something out there. I mean, even I remember I had a bereavement in my family, and I was at the hospital trying to deal with that grief, and I saw the front cover of a newspaper which was talking about Muslims supporting jihad, and I just wanted to rip it up and stamp on it. It was just so hard to deal with all these multiple kind of fitnas, really. So I would love for you to kind of talk us through how we can cope with that and how we can keep going through those tests.
Well, first, I just want to recognize that if you are a Muslim in the West, you are bombarded by so much. In addition to your own personal life and your own personal struggle, you're also dealing with a public existence where your very existence is a political statement that some people are offended by. And I don't realize how much of a weight I carry as an American Muslim. Just existing, literally just walking around visibly Muslim and trying to practice my faith in the most basic way. I don't realize the weight I carry until I leave America and go somewhere where I feel normal, where I am normal, where my identity is not politicized, where I'm not making a political statement by existing. So when I go to Istanbul, when I go to Doha, and I'm just an anonymous, random Muslim that no one is worried about, I just blend in. When my identity is normalized, I realize the weight I was carrying because I put it down. So first, we just have to recognize that we're carrying this invisible weight that other people may not realize is there, may not see, and it's taxing. It causes even health issues. I mean, in America, there are now, mounting studies specifically on racism, not so much on Islamophobia, but on anti-Black racism and on the health implications, the physical health implications of just living while Black in America. So bigotry and prejudice and your identity being politicized has an impact. We can't deny that. We can't pretend that it's not there. But what our faith offers us is meaning, is making meaning out of what may feel like chaos in our lives. And one of the most beautiful examples of this is in Surah Taha, the chapter called Taha in the Quran, one of several that detail the story of Musa or Moses, alayhi salam, peace be upon him. I love this surah, and I love the story of Musa in the Quran. There's so many lessons. This particular passage, though, is one that I think we really have to reflect on. So the story is that Musa and his family were walking in the dark. It was very dark, and they were lost in the desert after he had fulfilled his 10 years of work for his in-laws. And so he sees a fire, and he tells his family, I'm going to go over there to see if I can get some guidance, which is so ironic, right? And maybe get a flame for us to start our own fire, because they were cold and they were lost. And when he goes over to this burning, fire that he sees, of course we know that this is when he speaks to God. And in the conversation, this is a very long, we could talk about Surah Taha for the rest of the time, but we won't. I want to pinpoint something. In the conversation with God, Musa asks for the help of his brother Harun in the mission that he has just been given, which is, go to this tyrant and ask and demand that he free your people, and also tell him that he's not God. There's another God, which is the God. So the most difficult, intimidating, hard thing that you've ever been asked to do is what Moses was asked to do by God himself. And so he asks for help. He asks that his brother be his helper. And when God accepts this request and says, I will grant it, he tells him, and I have been giving you favors all along. He tells him, I'm going to help you now, and I'm going to answer your requests now, and I've been giving you all along. This isn't the first thing I've granted you. And then God goes to tell Musa, retell him his entire life story, which anyone reading would think this is a life story of tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy. You were born in a year where the tyrant of Egypt was killing all the Hebrews, all the children of Israel's boys. And you were born that year. You were going to be killed. Your mother, to save you, was inspired by God to put you in a cradle and put you in the Nile. Then your enemy took you in. You grew up in the midst of your enemy. Then you were involved in a murder. Then you were exiled. Then you worked hard for 10 years. And now you're here. Anyone hearing this is trial and tragedy after trial and tragedy. And yet Allah was retelling Musa his life story to tell him every single thing that just happened to you. He says, وَأَلْقَيْتُ عَلَيْكَ مَحَبَّةً مِنِّي. You were in the loving embrace and the eyes of your Lord. These things weren't random tragedies. hitting you one by one. They were purposeful. You were in our loving embrace the entire time. And they were preparing you. Because Allah says, these were all fitan, right? Fitna. And the word fitna means a trial. And it's also the word used for the polishing or the purification of a precious metal. It's the same root. To purify a precious metal is also uses the same root as fitna. So he was telling him his life story, but creating completely different meaning out of it. Assigning a different meaning to our life story is incredibly important. One that starts with the assumption that we are in the loving embrace of our Lord, even if it feels like tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy. And he basically tells him, you are exactly where you need to be, and every single thing that happened to you, as hard as it was purifying you, was protecting you, and was preparing you for this moment, for your purpose. And that story, it says in the same surah, these stories are not told to us because they're fairy tales and they're fun to listen to. These are stories we have to draw life lessons from. They are meant for us. This surah was revealed in the 6th year of the mission, a time of incredible difficulty for the Prophet ﷺ. And it was revealed as a comfort to him, to give him hope, and in turn to give us hope. The Quran was revealed to all of us. You see, we have to read this book as if it were just revealed for me. It's talking to you. It's meant for all of us. It is Allah's final message to humanity. Don't read it like an observer. It's a letter to you. It's a letter from your loving Lord. So interpret this ayah to apply to you too. Your life is not a series of random tragedies. Assign different meaning to your life. And that's where we find strength, and that's where we find hope. And that's exactly what happened with Musa alayhi salam. He started out feeling so afraid of this mission, feeling so unready, unfit for it. He complained to Allah of how he felt, I'm not eloquent like my brother. You know, Musa had a speech impediment. And he was the one that spoke to God. And he was the one that had nothing except his speech standing in the court of Pharaoh. And not only that, they had something on him. He was involved in a murder. So he felt very inadequate, like most of us feel in general, right? And yet he gained that strength when he finally had to stand before Pharaoh by assigning different meaning to the events of his life. And that's where we can gain strength as well.
Thank you so much. I'm glad I have some tissues next to me. I was saying we need a box of tissues because that really makes us reframe what's happening to ourselves. Looking at the story of Musa alayhi salam in the Quran, I mean, the lessons are right there, that we frame the tragedies or the tests that are happening to us from a place of love and hope and trust. And that's the reminder we have to keep telling ourselves as well. You know, but sometimes I find hope can be painful. If you keep praying for the same thing over and over again and it doesn't get answered, it's almost like, oh, just tell me if this isn't meant for me, then I'll just let it go. So how do we deal with things when even hope can seem like it can be painful?
You know, One of my favorite stories in the Quran, and I think this is I think a lot of people agree with me, is the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. And one of the lessons in his story is on this idea of delay. And I think it's really important to talk about. So the story of Yusuf alayhi salam is the whole thing starts with him relaying a dream to his father of stars in prostration to him. And of course his father says, don't tell your brothers. So this vision was from the very beginning. And you know the story of all these things that happened to him, one of which he was wrongly accused of a crime of honor and put in prison. And he asked his prison mate, right, my fellow prisoners, he talked to them in such a cordial, kind way, as if they were his equals, even though they had actually committed crimes and he hadn't. He asked one of them to remember him with his master when he left, so that he could get out of prison, because he has the skill of interpreting dreams. And it says that Shaitan made him forget, so he didn't remember. And Yusuf alayhi salam stayed in prison several more years as a result of that oversight on the part of his companion. And so there was a delay, as we just talked about, that there's delays. Now, I've been thinking about this delay, and I think there's so many interpretations, so I'm just going to give you like one possible, reason. Why was there this delay? He stayed in prison for several more years. And it occurred to me when I was reading another completely unrelated story about situations in America where women who have wrongly accused men of sexual violence finally, after years and years and years of lying, admit that they were lying. So a very important, famous example is Emmett Till. So Emmett Till, there's a movie about it. If you don't know who Emmett Till is, please look it up. He was a child who was lynched because a woman accused him of whistling at her. He was literally a child. And then years later, she actually admits she was lying and caused the death of a child, a very brutal, violent death of this black American boy. So time is necessary for people to find the conscience and the courage to admit they've lied. Now, what happened when Yusuf alayhi salam was asked to leave prison? He didn't leave except on his own terms, being exonerated. He literally refused to leave until they asked about the women who were cutting their hands. Had that man remembered him years before, they wouldn't have been ready to admit they lied. It takes time, and he wouldn't have been exonerated, and he would have left still under that suspicion. But the delay gave them time so that he was leaving prison with his honor intact. And then he didn't leave prison as a dream interpreter, which is what he would have left. He left prison with the honor to ask to be the Minister of Finance of Egypt. And that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't delayed. And then the vision came true because of the delay. His brothers wouldn't have been prostrating to a dream interpreter. So, delays make dreams come true. I want you to all remember that.
Thank you. That's such an important reminder. And with that, I'm going to actually open it up to the floor because I'm sure people will have some questions that they would like to put to you. There are volunteers going around. If you raise your hand, someone will bring you a mic. There's a gentleman in a white shirt in the middle, towards the back. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam
My name is Ubad Diab, Georgetown alum. I studied with Professor John Esposito in DC, so we read your Who Speaks for Islam. It's great to see you, and thank you for your very spiritually reinvigorating talk today.
Thank you.
I have two points. The first is on the idea of delay, and that this last point that you touch on is that it takes time. Subhanallah, yesterday I was reading Ibn Ata'illah Secondary's The Book of Wisdoms, and one of the things he says, and if you don't mind, I'll say it out in English. He says, if in spite of intense supplication, there is delay in the timing of the gift, let that not be the cause for your despairing, for he has guaranteed you a response in what he chooses for you, not in what you choose for yourself, and at the time he desires, not the time you desire. I felt that very much weaves into our conversation today, and I wanted to share that. My question to you is on the concept of assigning and making meaning out of chaos, trial, and tragedy. It's this moment immediately when a trial hits you. What Viktor Frankl talks about is logotherapy, of making meaning out of a specific occurrence in your life. Is how do you, maybe your piece of advice, and how do you train ourselves to constantly remember that there is purpose and meaning behind this trial, where, once it's struck, we may not see that very clearly. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much. So first, thank you for sharing the Ata'Allah wisdom that is so relevant to our conversation. What is the advice? I guess is we need to train our brain to think that way. And how do we do that? If we have trained our brain to make sense of those patterns of the past, to reflect on all the ways that Allah has saved us in the past, then in that moment, our brain will be much more likely, because it's trained to think that way, to make sense of that moment in its instance, not later on, in the same vein. But we have to do that work of reflecting and making meaning with the best assumptions of Allah, with the best assumptions of God. So the field of positive psychology, again, talks about this idea of post-traumatic growth. Not post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic growth. And while a lot of people thought that you can grow out of trauma just almost like by default, or, that everyone grows out of trauma, they found that that's not the case at all. Some people are damaged and not grow. There is no growth. It's actually the opposite. It's a decline after trauma. In the absence of reflection, in the absence of meaning making, and the story we make up, the narrative we assign to the events of our life is what decides if we grow or if we fall from a trauma. So if we have trained our brains to make sense of our lives in that way, where we start with this assumption, start with this question: how is God helping me grow into my best self through this? How am I being grown? This is my murabbi, right? This is the one developing me, my developer. How is he developing me into my best self through this trial, through this really grueling workout? We thank our trainers for hard workouts, right? They make us strong. This is the same thing. I was just going to say, I lost my second point. Well, if I remember it, I'll tell you. But I think it's about this idea of training ourselves to think in a certain way, and Surah Al-Duha does this, right? Because that's what I was going to say. Is Surah Al-Duha reminds the Prophet ﷺ exactly what I'm talking about. Remember when we saved you in all these ways? So in this moment, it's the same. It's a pattern. We're going to act the same as we always do, which is to save you and to take care of you and give you what you need. So now that you're struggling again, it's a pattern. You're going to think of it in the same way. But if you haven't taken the time to make that pattern, to notice that pattern in your life and reflect on it, then it won't be the spontaneous way you think about a tragedy in your life today.
Thank you. And there's a question down here in the second row, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for this incredible session, very inspiring. And sometimes we take our blessings for granted, and only when we have lost them, that's when it's a reality check. So my question to you is, we're talking about healing. So how do you cope with the loss of your loved ones, and how do you really heal? They say time is the biggest healer. As time passes, everything is going to be okay, but that's not the case. Every time you think of the loss of your loved one, it's so fresh in your mind.
Yeah.
So how exactly do you deal with it? That's my question. And especially when there's a fear that are you really going to ever be reunited, because Jannah is not an easy thing to get. So are you really going to be reunited with your loved one? That's my question, yeah.
It's a very hard question, and I don't have an easy answer. I lost my father a few months ago, so my grief is very fresh, and I definitely understand what you mean by losing your loved ones and grieving. Grief is a part of being human, and it's something that we have to allow ourselves to feel and go through. And as I reflected on, this past year, which has been very difficult for me because of the loss of my father and other changes as well, I realized that within that grief, there is also a great deal to be grateful for. And this isn't to take away from the grief, but it's just to think about life in a different paradigm. We often think of life as good times, then bad times, then good times, then bad times, then good times, peaks and valleys. But life is not like that. Life is actually more like a braid where there are threads of joy and threads of sorrow in the same time, and they're woven together. So threads of grief and threads of gratitude. Because inna ma'al usri yusra, right? With al-usr, which is finite, yusra, which is not finite. There's no alif lam. So it's open. It's not defined. It's an infinite amount. So with every hardship, there is ease. With a hardship, there is ease. With and not after. So noticing the ways that Allah has sent you comfort within your grief can be one way to help heal with time. I know that after my father's death, as in the darkest days of my grief, I also experienced incredible kindness from people. I had community members, strangers and friends alike, cooking for us. This is a sunnah, right? This is a part of our tradition. And we might take that for granted. It was like, it made such a difference to our family to be taken care of and embraced that way. And I really did see it as Allah sending us threads of kindness and joy in the midst of our grief, because life is a braid. I had friends who drove from across the country to come, express their condolences. I didn't take that for granted. There were moments of joy that I had to savor too. So one thing is to take care of yourself, to not let yourself become consumed by the grief, to find moments of joy and not to feel guilty about that. But grief takes time. It takes, and some people will tell you it's not that you ever get over it. It's something you carry with you your whole life. And one beautiful kind of analogy that I saw recently is that grief actually opens your heart for compassion. It unsheaths layers and exposes compassion you may not have known you had. It expands your heart. You know how much grief our Prophet had to deal with. I mean, he lost his father before he was born. He lost his mother at the age of 7, then his grandfather. Then he was abused and slandered. Then he lost his father figure, his uncle, then his wife. Then he went through trial after trial. He buried every single one of his children except one in his lifetime. And this is what was necessary to mold a heart that is called a rahmah to all the worlds. Because that kind of grief gave him compassion we can't even imagine. So grief has a purpose too. It's not a punishment. Everything you're experiencing and I experience in the human condition, every single thing we experience has a purpose. And that purpose is to truly call us back to Allah, call us back to God and to the service of His creation.
Thank you for your question, and what a beautiful answer. Thank you so much. There was also a question in the middle. I think we have time for one more. Could you raise your hand again? Who was just here on 4th row up. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, sometimes people tell you that the bad things that happen to you in your life are punishments for things that you might have done wrong. And I feel like when you think of things as punishment, it's hard to get better, it's hard to grow. So do the bad things that happen to you, are they really punishments?
Thank you so much for that question. I love that question because it's what so many people are wondering. And here's how I'd like to respond to that. You decide if it's a punishment or a purification. And here's what I mean by that. I posted this idea once that if you start from you start with the assumption that everything that happens to you, even the difficult things, like in the case of Musa alayhi salam, are the acts, the deliberate, willful acts of a loving God, you will have a totally different perspective. Now, I had someone respond and say, well, what if you were, doing all these things wrong and you were sinful and you were heedless and then this horrible calamity hit you? That's a punishment, obviously. That's not a purification. That's not the act of a loving God. That's an act of a wrathful God. That's an act of a punishing God. And I said, if you're walking on a street, if you're walking down a path and you're about to fall off a cliff, okay? You're walking and it's foggy and you just keep walking and there's a cliff and you're about to fall off of it. and someone, they call out to you and you can't hear them. There's a storm and it's too loud. And they're calling and calling, saying, there's a cliff, wait. You can't hear anything. So they give up on trying to get your attention through calling you. So the only thing they can think of to do is they pick up a stone and they throw it at your head to get your attention. And you turn around, you're like, whoa, thank you. Oh my God, I was about to fall off this cliff. Did that person punish you? Or did they do you the biggest favor of your life? So if a calamity comes after heedlessness and it causes you to make tawbah and turn around, that's not a punishment. That's not a punishment. That's the biggest favor. That is the act of a loving Lord. There are parents in the room. The right kind of parenting is, yes, we cause, we might inflict some discomfort on a child, taking away their iPhone or their tablet, and that feels like the worst punishment in the world, but it's to help them learn something, to stop them from committing a behavior that is harmful to them. That's not a punishment like, oh, I should feel bad. No, someone's trying to teach me something. Someone's trying to get me to turn around so I don't fall off a cliff. So if you turn around, then that calamity wasn't a punishment. It was a purification. It was a call to remind you to turn around. Now, if you ignore that and that hit in the head just doesn't do anything and you just keep going, then all you got was just a bruise on your head. Then that's a punishment. So you decide.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for all your questions. And I would like to thank you, Dalia, for such a compelling conversation and all of these beautiful wisdoms that you've shared with us today. Please join me in thanking Dalia Mogahed.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Ramona, for your phenomenal conversation. And I wanted Ramona to be my conversation partner today, and I'm so grateful that you were here. I didn't want this to be just a talk. I did want it to be a conversation, and I think it really worked well because you were here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's all due to you. And if you would like to hear more wisdoms as well, just follow Dalia on her social media handles, which are just up on the screen behind me. Honestly, they are life-changing. They really do help you through so many hardships in life. I often quote you in my work, so I'm very grateful to you. So please do follow Dalia. So this is sadly the final event for the Exploring Islam's campaign that's been going on. So thank you to everybody who has tirelessly worked. So I'm so tired I can't even say the word for all their hard work. Those lucky enough to have concert tickets for tonight's musical sensation, Maher Zain, who's live in concert tonight at the Katara Amphitheatre. I hope you enjoy it. Finally, a huge thank you to Exploring Islam Foundation and the Islam and Muslims Initiative for making today possible, for the entire campaign, which has been so wonderful to see around the city, and also the website and everything. We've really enjoyed it. Thank you also to our brilliant volunteers and everybody here at the Museum of Islamic Art. Thank you again to you, Dalia. And also, of course, thank you to all of you for coming today and sharing in this conversation. I really hope I get to see tonight's concert, but if not, just have a safe journey home and all the best. Thank you.